The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across my kitchen as I stood at the window, watching my neighbor's children play in their yard. The normalcy of the scene felt like a cruel mockery of what my own family had become. 3 weeks had passed since I'd filed for divorce from Robert, and in those 3 weeks, I'd watched my children's warmth toward me slowly transform into something cold and distant that I couldn't understand. My name is Catherine Sullivan. I'm 60 years old, and I never imagined I'd be living through something like this. After 35 years of marriage, I thought I knew my husband completely. I thought I understood the man I'd built a life with, raised children with, and trusted with my deepest vulnerabilities. But as I stood there in my kitchen, holding a crumpled receipt I'd just discovered in my coat pocket, I realized how wrong I'd been. Before I share this shocking experience, please show your support with a like and subscribe. Comment your location below. The receipt was from Miller's Diner, a small restaurant about 20 minutes from our house. Nothing unusual about that, except for 2 things. First, it was dated from last Tuesday afternoon when Robert had told me he was working late at his accounting firm. Second, the receipt showed charges for 3 meals, not 1. 3 sodas, 3 sandwiches, 3 slices of pie. Robert didn't eat pie, had been avoiding sweets since his diabetes diagnosis 2 years ago. But our children, Emma and David, both loved Miller's famous apple pie. My hands trembled slightly as I studied the faded print. Robert Sullivan, my husband of 35 years, had been meeting with our adult children behind my back. The same children who had grown increasingly distant since I'd announced my intention to divorce their father. The same children who now seemed to view every conversation with me as an interrogation, every family dinner as a battlefield. Emma Sullivan had always been my confidant. At 28, she was a successful marketing coordinator with an apartment downtown, but she still called me every Sunday morning to chat about her week. We'd shop together, share recipes, and she'd often stop by unannounced just to steal leftovers from my refrigerator. But 3 weeks ago, those Sunday calls had stopped. When I'd asked her about it during our last tense conversation, she'd simply said she was busy with work and needed space to process everything. David Sullivan, my 30-year-old son, had always been more reserved than his sister, but even he had grown cold in ways that bewildered me. He'd canceled our monthly lunch dates twice in a row, claiming scheduling conflicts with his job at the insurance company. When he did speak to me, his responses were clipped and formal, as if I were a stranger rather than the mother who had bandaged his scraped knees and cheered at every Little League game. The only person who seemed to understand my confusion was my friend Margaret Chen, who lived just 2 streets over. Margaret had been my neighbor for 15 years, ever since she and her late husband moved to our subdivision. We'd bonded over our shared love of gardening and had supported each other through various family crises over the years. She'd been a steadying presence during the difficult months leading up to my decision to file for divorce, listening without judgment as I'd wrestled with the reality that my marriage had become more obligation than partnership. Margaret had noticed the change in my children's behavior too. Just last week, she'd commented on how strange it was that Emma's car hadn't been in my driveway recently, and how David had walked right past her at the grocery store without his usual friendly greeting. I walked to my kitchen table and sat down, spreading the receipt flat against the worn wood surface. The timestamp showed 2:30 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. What were my adult children doing having lunch with their father in the middle of a workday? And why hadn't any of them mentioned it to me? My phone sat silent on the counter. No missed calls or text messages from either Emma or David. The quiet felt oppressive, so different from the constant communication we'd maintained throughout their adult lives. I'd raised them to be independent, to build their own lives, but I'd never expected them to shut me out so completely. The late afternoon light was fading now, casting my kitchen in that golden hour glow that usually brought me peace. Instead, I felt a growing sense of unease as I considered the implications of what I'd discovered. Robert was many things, but he wasn't spontaneous. He didn't arrange casual lunches without purpose. Every meeting, every conversation, every decision was calculated and deliberate. If he was meeting secretly with our children, there was a reason. I thought back to the last real conversation I'd had with Emma, 2 weeks ago when she'd stopped by to pick up some books she'd left in her old bedroom. She'd been polite but distant, asking pointed questions about my plans for the future and whether I'd really thought through all the consequences of the divorce. At the time, I'd assumed she was naturally worried about the family changes. Now I wondered if there was more to her questions than maternal concern. The sound of my neighbor's screen door slamming shut broke through my thoughts. Through the window, I watched Margaret Chen walking across her backyard, checking on the tomato plants in her garden. She moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that small, consistent actions led to larger results. Perhaps it was time to share my discovery with someone who might help me understand what was really happening in my own family. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Margaret's number, then hesitated. Once I voiced my suspicions out loud, there would be no taking them back. Once I admitted that I believed my husband was actively working to turn our children against me, I'd have to face whatever came next. The trap I'd missed finally sprang shut. My finger hovered over Margaret's contact, but something made me pause. What if I was overreacting? What if there was an innocent explanation for the lunch receipt? I set the phone down and decided to do what I should have done from the beginning: talk directly to my children. I scrolled to David's number instead and pressed call. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. His cheerful recorded voice felt like a mockery of the distance that had grown between us. I didn't leave a message. Emma's phone went straight to voicemail too. The knot in my stomach tightened. When had my children become so unavailable to me? I walked to the living room and settled into my reading chair. The one Robert had always complained was too worn to keep. The soft cushions had molded to my body over the years, and sitting there usually brought me comfort. Tonight, it felt like the only safe space in a house that no longer felt like home. My mind wandered back to the early years of my marriage, when Robert and I had made decisions together about bedtime stories and discipline, about which schools to choose, and how to handle teenage rebellion. We'd been a team then, or at least I'd believed we were. Looking back now, I wondered how many times he'd been working his quiet influence even then, shaping situations to his advantage while I remained oblivious. The house creaked around me as it settled into evening quiet. I found myself listening for sounds that wouldn't come. No key in the front door, no footsteps in the hallway, no casual conversation drifting from the kitchen. The isolation felt deliberate now, crafted rather than circumstantial. I thought about Emma's questions during her last visit, the way she'd asked about my future plans with such careful phrasing. Had those been her words, or had Robert coached her on what to say? The idea made my chest tight with something that felt like grief. If I was right, if Robert was systematically turning our children against me, then I was losing more than a marriage. I was losing the family I'd spent decades building. My phone buzzed on the side table. A text message from David. "Hey, Mom, can't talk tonight. Busy with work stuff. Maybe this weekend?" I stared at the message, analyzing each word like it might contain hidden meaning. Busy with work stuff felt vague, dismissive, and maybe this weekend wasn't the kind of definitive response David usually gave. He was typically specific about his plans, eager to schedule time together. I typed back, "Of course, honey. I love you." He responded with a thumbs up emoji. No, love you too. No smiley face. Just a digital acknowledgement that felt colder than no response at all. The silence in the house grew heavier. I picked up my phone again and called Margaret, decision made. I found something today, I said when she answered. A restaurant receipt in Robert's jacket pocket. He had lunch with both Emma and David on Tuesday afternoon, and none of them mentioned it to me. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. That does seem odd. What kind of lunch place? Romano's. You know, that upscale Italian place downtown. Not somewhere you go for a quick bite. I paused, hearing how paranoid I might sound. Margaret, what if he's really doing what I suspected? What if he's trying to turn them against me? Have you tried talking to Emma and David directly? I called both of them just now. David sent a brush-off text, and Emma didn't respond at all. That's not like them, Margaret. We talk almost every day usually. I heard Margaret moving around her kitchen, the familiar sounds of someone tidying up after dinner. The normalcy of it made my own situation feel even more surreal. I keep thinking about something Emma said when she was here last week, I continued. She asked if I'd really thought through all the consequences of the divorce. It felt like she was warning me about something, but I couldn't figure out what. What kind of consequences do you think she meant? The question hung in the air between us. I knew what I feared, but saying it out loud felt like giving it power. I think Robert might be telling them things about the divorce settlement, about money, about the house, about how the separation will affect them. He's probably painting me as the selfish one, the one who's destroying the family. My voice cracked on the last words. The possibility that my own children might see me as the villain in this story was almost unbearable. You don't know that for certain, Margaret said gently. But if you're right, you need to find out what's really being said in those conversations. After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room, not bothering to turn on the lamps. The streetlight outside cast long shadows across the walls, and I watched them shift and change as cars passed by. Each set of headlights made me hope for a moment that one of my children might be coming to visit, might be ready to have an honest conversation about what was happening to our family. But the cars all drove past, and I remained alone with my growing certainty that the family I'd thought I knew was slipping away from me, one secret meeting at a time. I was still sitting there when my phone rang at nearly 10 o'clock. Emma's name appeared on the screen, and my heart jumped with relief and apprehension in equal measure. Mom? Emma's voice sounded strained, uncertain. We need to talk, but not over the phone. Can you meet me tomorrow morning? Of course. Where? The coffee shop on Maple Street, 10 o'clock. She paused, and I could hear her breathing. Mom, there are some things you need to know about Dad. Things he's been saying, things he's asking us to do. The line went dead, and I stared at the phone in my hand, my heart racing. Whatever I was about to learn, I knew it would change everything. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined what Emma might tell me, what Robert had been saying behind my back. The hours crawled by as I replayed every interaction with my children over the past few months, searching for clues I'd missed. By morning, I felt hollow and anxious. I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table where we could talk privately. My hands shook slightly as I wrapped them around my mug, the warmth doing nothing to calm my nerves. Emma walked in exactly at 10, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept either. When she sat down across from me, I noticed the dark circles under her eyes and the way she kept glancing around the room. Thank you for meeting me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Emma nodded, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup in a gesture so similar to mine that it might have made me smile under different circumstances. Instead, it just reminded me how much was at stake. "Mom, I need to tell you what's been happening with Dad." Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. "He's been asking David and me to choose sides. Not directly, but in ways that make it clear what he wants from us." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "He keeps telling us about all the sacrifices he made for the family. How he worked long hours to provide for us while you got to stay home with us when we were little. He makes it sound like you never appreciated anything he did." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "And then he talks about how the divorce is going to ruin his retirement. How he'll have to work for years longer than he planned because of the settlement." The words hit me like physical blows. I thought about all the conversations Robert and I had about my staying home when the children were young. How we'd agreed together that it was best for our family. Now he was rewriting that history, making my choices seem selfish rather than mutual decisions. "What else?" I managed to ask. "He's been showing us financial documents, papers about the house, about his retirement accounts. He keeps saying he just wants us to understand the reality of the situation, but it feels like he's trying to prove that you're taking more than you deserve." Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Mom, I don't understand most of those numbers, but the way he presents them makes it seem like you're being greedy." I felt a surge of anger at Robert's manipulation, but underneath it was a deeper hurt. He wasn't just fighting me in court or in mediation. He was fighting me for our children's loyalty, using their love for both of us as a weapon. "And David?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "David's angrier than I am. Dad's been talking to him about man-to-man responsibility, about how David needs to look out for his father now that the family is falling apart." Emma's voice grew stronger, more indignant. "He's putting pressure on David to take his side, making him feel guilty if he doesn't." That explained David's cold response to my call yesterday. Robert wasn't just trying to turn my children against me. He was burdening them with adult responsibilities and loyalties they shouldn't have to carry. "Emma, I need you to know something," I said, leaning forward. "The decision to divorce wasn't made lightly, and it wasn't made to hurt anyone. Your father and I both contributed to the problems in our marriage, but I can't continue living the way we were." "I know, Mom. That's why I called you." Emma reached across the table and took my hand. At first, some of what Dad said made sense. I was angry about the divorce, about everything changing. But then I realized he was asking me to stop talking to you as much, to pull back from our relationship. That's when I knew something was really wrong. Relief flooded through me so intensely I nearly started crying right there in the coffee shop. At least one of my children could see through Robert's manipulation. "What about David?" I asked. Emma's expression grew troubled. "He's struggling more. Dad's been spending more time with him, taking him out for dinner, asking for his advice about things. David feels important, but also burdened. I think part of him knows what's happening isn't right, but he doesn't want to disappoint Dad." I thought about my son, barely 22, being asked to shoulder the weight of his father's bitterness and financial anxieties. It wasn't fair to him, and it wasn't fair to Emma to have to navigate these impossible loyalties. "What do you think I should do?" I asked Emma, genuinely wanting her perspective. "Talk to David directly, not about Dad's meetings with us, but about your relationship with him. He needs to hear from you that loving both his parents doesn't mean he has to choose between them." Emma squeezed my hand. "And Mom? You might want to talk to your lawyer about what Dad's been doing. I don't know if it's legal or not, but it doesn't feel right." After Emma left, I sat in the coffee shop for another hour, processing everything she'd told me. I felt proud of my daughter for seeing through her father's manipulation, but worried about David and the position Robert had put him in. Most of all, I felt a new determination to fight not just for a fair divorce settlement, but for the preservation of my relationships with my children. I pulled out my phone and started typing a text to David, then deleted it. This conversation needed to happen face to face. But as I was putting my phone away, it buzzed with a message from Robert himself. "We need to talk about the children's involvement in our situation. Tonight, 7 o'clock at the house." My hands started shaking again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from anger, and from the knowledge that the real battle was just beginning. I stared at Robert's text message, my coffee growing cold as the weight of his words settled over me. The casual way he'd written, "the children's involvement in our situation," made my stomach turn. As if he hadn't been the one orchestrating their involvement all along. The drive home felt endless, even though it was only 15 minutes from the coffee shop. I kept rehearsing what I would say to him, how I would confront him about the secret meetings without revealing that Emma had told me everything. The autumn air was crisp against my face as I walked up the front steps of what had been our home for 18 years, but now felt like enemy territory. Robert was waiting in the living room, sitting in his usual chair with a glass of scotch already half empty. He looked tired, older somehow, with dark circles under his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. For just a moment, I felt a flicker of the old sympathy I used to have for him when work stressed him out or when his father had been sick. Then I remembered Emma's words about him asking her to pull back from our relationship, and the sympathy evaporated. "You wanted to talk," I said, not bothering to sit down. I stayed near the doorway, maintaining the distance that had grown between us over these past months. "I think we need to establish some ground rules about how we discuss this divorce with Emma and David," Robert said, swirling the scotch in his glass. "They're adults, but they're still our children. We have a responsibility to protect them from the messier aspects of what we're going through." The irony was so thick I almost laughed out loud. Here he was, talking about protecting our children while simultaneously using them as weapons in our divorce. I watched his face carefully, looking for any sign that he knew I was aware of his manipulation tactics. "What kind of ground rules did you have in mind?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Well, for starters, I don't think either of us should be discussing the financial details with them. They don't need to know about asset division or alimony or any of that. It just creates anxiety for them." Robert took another sip of his drink, and I noticed his hand was slightly unsteady. I felt heat rising in my chest. "I haven't discussed financial details with them, Robert. Have you?" "Of course not," he said, but something flickered across his expression. "I just think we should both agree not to put them in the middle of our disagreements. They shouldn't have to choose sides." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. I gripped the doorframe to steady myself, fighting the urge to scream at him about everything Emma had told me. Instead, I took a deep breath and tried a different approach. "You're absolutely right," I said, watching his face relax slightly. "They shouldn't have to choose sides, so I'm assuming you'll stop having those private conversations with them about our marriage problems?" Robert's eyes sharpened, and I saw him trying to figure out exactly how much I knew. "I don't know what you mean by private conversations. I talk to our children because I'm their father, not because I'm trying to influence them." "Emma came to see me today," I said quietly. The color drained from Robert's face, and he set his glass down with a sharp clink against the side table. For a long moment, We stared at each other across the living room that had once been filled with family game nights and Christmas morning chaos. "What did she tell you?" he asked finally. "She told me that you've been meeting with her and David separately, that you've been discussing our financial situation, asking them for advice about the divorce, and suggesting they limit their contact with me." My voice was steady, but I could feel my pulse racing. "She also told me that David is struggling with the burden you've placed on him." Robert stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair in the gesture I'd seen countless times over our 24-year marriage. "Look, Sarah, you don't understand the pressure I'm under here. The lawyers, the finances, trying to figure out how we're going to split everything. I needed someone to talk to." "Then talk to a therapist, or your brother, or a friend," I snapped, my careful composure finally cracking. "Don't put our children in the position of having to manage your emotional needs while they're trying to process their own feelings about our divorce." "They're not children anymore," Robert said, his voice rising. "Emma is 25 and David is 22. They're adults who can handle knowing the truth about what's happening to their family." "The truth?" I stepped fully into the living room now, my anger propelling me forward. "Or your version of the truth? Because according to Emma, you've been painting me as the villain in our story, while positioning yourself as the victim." Robert's jaw tightened, and I saw a flash of the defensiveness that had characterized so many of our arguments over the past year. "Maybe if you'd been more willing to work on our marriage instead of giving up at the first sign of trouble, we wouldn't be in this situation." "The first sign of trouble?" I stared at him in disbelief. "Robert, we've been having the same fights for 3 years. We tried counseling twice. I begged you to prioritize our relationship over your work, and you told me I was being needy and unrealistic." "That's not what happened," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's exactly what happened, and now you're rewriting history for our children, trying to make them believe that I'm the one who destroyed our family." I felt tears threatening, but I pushed them back. I needed to stay strong for this conversation. Robert sank back into his chair, suddenly looking defeated. "I don't know what you want me to say, Sarah. I'm scared. I'm scared about money, about losing the house, about the kids choosing you over me. Maybe I haven't handled things perfectly, but I'm doing the best I can." For a moment, I saw the man I'd fallen in love with all those years ago, vulnerable and uncertain beneath all the bravado and manipulation. But I also thought about David, barely out of college, and being asked to shoulder his father's fears and insecurities. "I understand that you're scared," I said more gently. "But using our children as emotional support and turning them against me isn't the answer. It's damaging them, and it's damaging any chance we have of co-parenting successfully after the divorce." "So, what do you want me to do?" Robert asked, looking up at me with something that might have been genuine remorse. Before I could answer, I heard the front door open and David's voice calling out, "Dad? Mom? Are you both here? We need to talk." My heart hammered as footsteps approached the living room. David appeared in the doorway, his face flushed from the cold, but Emma wasn't with him. He looked between Robert and me, clearly sensing the tension that hung heavy in the air. "Where's your sister?" Robert asked, straightening in his chair. "She's coming. She had to park down the street." David unwound his scarf, his eyes darting between us again. "Look, we need to clear the air about some things. Emma told me about the conversation you two had yesterday, Mom." I felt my stomach clench. "David, your father and I were just discussing—" "No, let me finish." David held up his hand, and I was struck by how much he looked like Robert when he was determined about something. Emma said you think Dad's been trying to turn us against you? Is that true? Robert started to speak, but David cut him off too. Dad, I'm asking Mom first. I glanced at Robert, who was staring at the floor, his jaw working silently. The vulnerability I'd glimpsed moments earlier had vanished, replaced by something harder to read. Yes, I said finally. I think your father has been sharing things with you both that put me in a negative light while making himself look like the victim in our marriage. David nodded slowly. And Dad, is that what you've been doing? The question hung in the air. Robert looked up, his eyes moving between David and me. I've been honest with you both about what's happening in our family. I haven't lied about anything. That's not the same thing as not manipulating the situation, I said quietly. Mom's right. The voice came from behind David, and we all turned to see Emma entering the room. She'd clearly been listening from the hallway. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, but her expression was serious. Dad, you haven't technically lied, but you've definitely been strategic about what you tell us and when. Robert's face reddened. Emma, that's not fair. I'm your father, and I have every right to what? Emma moved to stand beside David, and I was struck by how united they looked. To make us feel guilty about Mom's decisions? To make us worry about whether you'll be okay financially? To make us feel like we have to choose sides? I never asked you to choose sides, Robert protested. You didn't have to ask, David said. When you tell me that Mom's lawyer is trying to take the house and leave you with nothing, what am I supposed to think? When you tell Emma that Mom won't even try to work things out, how is that not asking us to judge her? I watched Robert's face cycle through emotions: anger, hurt, defiance, and something that looked almost like shame. I was scared, he said finally. I am scared. I don't know how to do this, how to be divorced, how to be alone. I thought if you understood what I was going through, you'd what, Dad? Emma's voice was gentle but firm. Support you? We do support you. We love you. But we love Mom too, and watching you two hurt each other is killing us. David sat down on the edge of the coffee table, facing both Robert and me. Here's the thing. Emma and I talked about this for hours last night. We're adults, and we can see what's happening. This isn't just about Mom giving up on the marriage, or Dad being scared about money. You two have been making each other miserable for years. The words stung because they were true. I sank onto the couch across from Robert, feeling suddenly exhausted. We remember the fights, Emma continued, settling beside me. We remember Dad working until 9 or 10 every night, and Mom eating dinner alone. We remember the counseling appointments and the arguments about whether Dad would actually prioritize them. And we remember Mom getting quieter and sadder, David added, looking directly at me. And more frustrated every time Dad promised things would change, and then they didn't. Robert was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I know I wasn't the husband I should have been. I know I let work consume me, but I was doing it for our family, to provide for everyone. Dad, Emma said softly, we know you love us, and we know you love Mom, even now. But love isn't enough if you can't show it in ways that matter to the other person. I felt tears starting to form and blinked them back. Your father isn't the only one who made mistakes. I could have been more patient, more understanding about the pressures he was under at work. Mom, stop. David's voice was firm. You don't have to defend your decision to get divorced. Emma and I have talked about this, and honestly, we think you should have done it 2 years ago. The silence that followed was deafening. Robert looked like David had slapped him. "What we can't handle," Emma continued, "is you two using us as weapons against each other. Dad, when you tell us Mom's being unreasonable about the house, you're asking us to take your side. Mom, when you get upset that we've been talking to Dad about the divorce, it makes us feel like we're betraying you by caring about him." I stared at my daughter, amazed by her clarity and maturity. "You're right. I'm sorry. I should never have made you feel that way." Robert cleared his throat. I'm sorry too. I didn't realize I was putting you both in that position." "Yes, you did," David said quietly. "Maybe not consciously, but part of you knew. Just like part of you knew that telling us about Mom's lawyer was meant to make us angry at her." Robert's shoulders sagged. "You're right. I was angry and scared, and I wanted you to understand why." "We do understand," Emma said, "but we need you both to handle your anger and fear without involving us. We want to support you both through this, but we can't do that if we're constantly being asked to referee or take sides." I looked at Robert, really looked at him, and saw the man I'd been married to for 26 years, flawed, scared, but not malicious. "Can we agree to that? Can we agree to keep the kids out of our conflicts going forward?" Robert nodded, but before he could speak, David held up his hand again. "Actually, there's something else we need to talk about. Emma and I have made a decision about Christmas, and we need to tell you both together." My heart rate picked up immediately. Christmas was only 3 weeks away, and I'd been dreading the conversation about how we'd handle the holidays. The idea of splitting time, of forced cheerfulness, of pretending everything was normal while our family fell apart. It had been keeping me awake at night. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "What kind of decision?" Emma and David exchanged a look, and I could see they'd clearly discussed this at length. Emma took a deep breath. "We've decided we don't want to do the whole back and forth thing this year. We don't want Christmas morning at one house and Christmas dinner at another, or splitting Christmas Eve and Christmas Day." "Okay," I said carefully, not sure where this was heading. "What do you want to do instead?" David leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "We want to do Christmas together, all 4 of us, one last time." The words hung in the air. Robert looked stunned, and I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't quite sort through. Relief, sadness, fear, and something else I didn't want to name. "Together?" Robert repeated. "Look," Emma said, "we know this divorce is happening. We're not trying to get you back together or pretend everything's fine. But Christmas has always been our favorite family time, and this year feels like the end of something important. We want to say goodbye to our family traditions properly." I felt tears threatening again. "Honey, I don't know if that's a good idea. Your father and I can manage to be civil for one day," David finished. "Can't you? For us?" Robert was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed. "Where would we do this?" "The house," Emma said immediately. "Mom's keeping it, so this would be Dad's last Christmas there anyway. We want to wake up Christmas morning in our childhood bedrooms one more time. Come downstairs to presents under the tree we've had since David was 5. My chest felt tight. The practicalities started flooding my mind immediately. Sleeping arrangements, how we'd navigate the awkwardness, whether we could actually pull this off without a major fight. "I know what you're thinking, Mom," Emma said, reading my expression. "But we've thought about this. Dad can stay in the guest room. We'll do all our normal traditions. Christmas Eve, pizza and movies, Christmas morning presents, the big dinner." Just like always, except we'll all know it's the last time." "And then what?" I asked quietly. "What happens after Christmas?" David's voice was steady but sad. "Then you two figure out your separate lives, and Emma and I figure out how to have relationships with both of you, in whatever way works. But we'll have had one proper goodbye to the family we used to be." Robert cleared his throat. "What if we can't handle it? What if we end up fighting and ruin the whole day for you?" "Then you'll ruin it," Emma said with a slight shrug. "But we think you care about us enough to not let that happen. And honestly, the alternative is our first Christmas as a divorced family, which is going to be awful no matter how we do it. At least this way, we're choosing to make something meaningful out of the awfulness." I looked at Robert, trying to imagine us navigating Christmas morning together, pretending to be a family, while knowing we were saying goodbye to 26 years of marriage. The thought terrified me, but the hope in my children's eyes terrified me more to disappoint. "There would have to be ground rules," I said slowly. "No discussions about the divorce, the lawyers, the house, any of it. No passive-aggressive comments, no bringing up old fights." Robert nodded. "Agreed. Just Christmas." "And no pretending everything's fine either," David added. "We don't need fake cheer. We just need you two to treat each other with basic kindness for 48 hours. Emma bit her lip. "There's one more thing. We want to do something we've never done before. We want to each share a favorite memory from when we were a real family. Not to make anyone feel guilty or sad, but to acknowledge the good things before we let them go." The room fell silent again. I could hear the old house settling around us, the same sounds I'd been listening to for 15 years of Christmases. The idea of Robert sleeping down the hall one more time, of all of us eating breakfast together Christmas morning, felt both impossible and necessary. "I need to think about this," I said finally. "No," Emma said firmly. "We need an answer now. If we're doing this, we all have to commit completely. No backing out on Christmas Eve because it feels too weird. No leaving early because things get uncomfortable." Robert was looking at me, and I realized this decision couldn't be made individually. We both had to agree, right now, in front of our children. "Sarah," he said quietly, using my name for the first time since he'd arrived. "I think we owe them this." But before I could answer, David's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his expression completely changed. "Oh no," he said, his face going pale. "Mom, we have a bigger problem." My heart lurched as I watched the color drain from David's face. The weight of our family meeting, the discussion about Christmas, everything suddenly felt secondary to whatever had just appeared on his phone screen. "What is it?" I asked, moving closer to where he sat. David looked up at me, then at Robert, then back at his phone. "It's from my landlord. He's selling the building. I have 30 days to move out." Emma leaned over to look at his phone. 30 days? Can he do that?" "Apparently he can," David said, scrolling through what looked like a lengthy message. "The new owners want to renovate and convert to condos. Everyone in the building got the same notice." I felt my stomach drop. David had been struggling financially since graduating college 6 months ago. His job at the nonprofit barely covered his current rent, and finding a new place in this market with 30 days' notice would be nearly impossible. "Do you have any savings?" Robert asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Barely enough for first month's rent somewhere. Definitely not enough for first, last, and security deposit." David ran his hands through his hair. "And that's assuming I can even find a place that quickly." The irony wasn't lost on me. Here we'd been discussing our last Christmas together as a family, and suddenly our son might be homeless by New Year's. The timing felt like some cosmic joke. "You can stay here," I said immediately, "until you find something." "Mom, you're about to go through a divorce. The last thing you need is your adult son moving back home." "But where else would you go?" Emma asked. David glanced at Robert. "I could crash on Dad's couch in his apartment temporarily, but it's barely big enough for one person." Robert shifted uncomfortably. "Of course you're welcome, but Sarah's right. The house makes more sense. More space, your old room is still set up." I stared at him, realizing what this meant. "But if you're staying here for Christmas like we just discussed, and David moves back in, we'd all be living under the same roof while going through divorce proceedings," Robert finished. "Yeah, I see the problem." Emma was quiet for a moment, then looked up with that same determined expression she'd worn when proposing our Christmas arrangement. "Maybe it's not a problem. Maybe it's exactly what we need." "Emma?" I started, but she held up her hand. "Think about it. We were just talking about one last Christmas together, right? Well, what if instead of 2 days, we had a few weeks to actually figure out how to be a family that's changing instead of a family that's broken?" David looked skeptical. "You want Mom and Dad to live together while getting divorced? That sounds like a recipe for disaster." "Or it sounds like a chance to practice what we just agreed to," Emma countered. "If you two can handle Christmas morning together, maybe you can handle being housemates for a few weeks while David finds a new place." I looked around the living room, trying to imagine Robert back in this space for more than 48 hours. His coffee mug in the sink again, his shoes by the front door, the sound of him moving around upstairs while I tried to sleep. "The lawyers would have a field day with this," I said. "Why? You're separated, not under a restraining order, and it's temporary, with a clear end date tied to David's housing situation," Robert said. "Besides, it might actually make some of the practical discussions easier, dividing belongings, figuring out finances. Or it might make everything infinitely more complicated," I replied. David looked between us. "Look, I appreciate the offer, but I don't want to be the reason you two end up in a worse place than you already are. I can figure something else out." "Like what?" Emma asked. "Sleep in your car? Max out credit cards for some overpriced extended stay hotel?" The room fell quiet as we all contemplated the reality of David's situation. 30 days wasn't much time, and the rental market was brutal. Even if he found something affordable, he'd need time to save up for deposits and moving costs. "What if we set ground rules?" I heard myself saying. "Like we discussed for Christmas, but extended. Separate spaces within the house, scheduled times for common areas, absolutely no discussions about the divorce unless it's directly related to logistics." Robert nodded slowly. "I could take the guest room. David keeps his old room. We'd need to coordinate bathroom schedules, maybe alternate who cooks dinner." "And if it's not working?" David asked. "If you two start making each other miserable?" "Then we revisit," Emma said. "But at least you'd have a stable place to stay while apartment hunting, and maybe Mom and Dad would learn they can coexist without wanting to kill each other." I found myself actually considering it. The house felt too big and too quiet most evenings anyway. Having David back, even temporarily, might be a comfort. And if Robert and I were going to successfully co-parent Emma through her senior year, we needed to learn how to be in the same space without everything becoming a battlefield. "There's something else," Robert said quietly. "Something I haven't told any of you yet." The weight of Robert's words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Emma shifted forward on the couch, her expression immediately alert. David stopped fidgeting with his phone and looked up sharply. "What kind of something?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. We'd already covered so much ground tonight, made so many tentative steps towards something that resembled functional family communication. Robert ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I'd seen him make countless times over the years when he was trying to figure out how to say something difficult. I got laid off 3 weeks ago. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's mouth fell open slightly. David sat up straighter, his earlier housing concerns suddenly taking on a different dimension. 3 weeks ago? I repeated. You've been coming to these family discussions, talking about lawyers and divorce settlements, and you didn't think to mention that you don't currently have an income? I was going to tell you, Robert said quickly. But everything was so complicated already, and I didn't want it to seem like I was trying to manipulate the situation or make you feel sorry for me. Dad, that's huge, Emma said. Why didn't you say anything? Robert looked at his hands. Because I kept thinking I'd find something quickly. I've got some interviews lined up, and my severance will cover me for another month, maybe 2 if I'm careful. But you're right, it does complicate things. I felt a familiar surge of anger mixed with something that might have been concern. So, when you offered to move back in temporarily to help with David's situation, you were also solving your own housing problem. Partially, yes, Robert admitted, but that doesn't make the offer less genuine. David needs a place to stay, and honestly, we both could probably benefit from splitting household expenses for a while. David looked between us. Okay, so now I really don't want to impose. You two have enough to figure out without me adding to the mix. Actually, Emma said slowly, maybe this makes more sense, not less. Think about it. Dad can't exactly afford to rent his own place right now anyway. David needs somewhere to stay while he saves money and finds an apartment. Mom's rattling around in this house by herself most of the time. I'm not rattling around, I protested. You had cereal for dinner 4 nights last week, Emma pointed out. I saw the evidence in the sink. That was convenience, not loneliness, I said, but even as the words came out, I knew they weren't entirely true. Robert shifted in his chair. Look, I know how this sounds. Unemployed husband suddenly wants to move back home right when the son needs a place to crash. But the finances actually work out better for everyone this way. We split utilities 3 ways instead of maintaining separate households. David saves money for his own place. I don't drain my severance paying rent somewhere. And what happens when you find a new job? I asked. Do you just move out again? Do we keep pretending we're separated while living under the same roof? We figure it out as we go, Robert said. Just like we're doing with everything else. David stood up and started pacing, something he'd done since he was little when he was thinking through a problem. This is crazy. 6 months ago, we were a normal family. Now we're negotiating living arrangements like we're planning some kind of commune. We were never a normal family, Emma said with a slight smile. Remember when Dad decided to raise chickens in the backyard without telling Mom first? Or when Mom signed us all up for that family camping trip without checking if anyone actually wanted to sleep in the woods, David added, his expression softening slightly at the memory. Those chickens were going to be a great investment, Robert said defensively. And that camping trip was character building. The camping trip was a disaster, I said. You forgot the tent stakes, Emma got poison ivy, and David fell in the lake. But we still talk about it, Emma pointed out. And we all survived? I looked around at my family, this group of people I'd been so angry with, so hurt by, so convinced I needed to protect myself from. Here we were, discussing the possibility of voluntarily living together again despite everything that had happened. It was either the most mature decision we'd ever made as a family, or the most foolish. If we do this, I said slowly, we need more than ground rules. We need a clear timeline, a plan for what happens when things inevitably get complicated. What kind of timeline? Robert asked. David finds a place within 60 days, not 30. That's more realistic for saving money and actually finding something decent. You actively job hunt and keep us informed about your progress. When you do find work, we reassess whether this arrangement still makes sense for anyone. And the divorce? David asked quietly. The question hung in the air. Emma watched me carefully, and I could see Robert tense slightly. The divorce proceedings don't stop, I said finally. Whatever we figure out living-wise, legally, we're still moving toward separation. This is about practicality, not reconciliation. Robert nodded, though I caught something that might have been disappointment flicker across his face. Understood. So, we're really doing this? Emma asked. The whole family back under one roof? With schedules and rules and probably way too much togetherness? Apparently we are, I said, at least temporarily. David stopped pacing and looked at us. There's something else we should probably discuss before we finalize this plan. We all turned to look at him, and I felt my stomach tighten. After Robert's unemployment revelation, I wasn't sure I could handle another surprise. What now? Emma asked. David took a deep breath. I might not be the only one who needs somewhere to stay. The words hit the room like a physical blow. I felt my shoulders sag as I processed what David had just said, and I watched Emma's face shift from cautious optimism to something approaching exasperation. David, I said, my voice carrying a warning tone I hadn't used since he was 16 and coming home past curfew. What exactly does that mean? He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture so familiar it transported me back 20 years to homework battles and teenage explanations that never quite made sense. The living room suddenly felt smaller, the afternoon light streaming through the windows somehow less warm than it had been moments before. My roommate situation is complicated, David began, then stopped himself. Actually, no, it's not complicated. It's over. My roommate is moving out at the end of the month, and I can't afford the rent on my own. I was going to have to move anyway. Robert leaned forward in his chair, his business mind clearly calculating. So this isn't just about helping us through an awkward transition period. You actually need this arrangement. We both do, David said, looking directly at his father. You need a place to stay. I need a place to stay, and Mom has a house with empty bedrooms. I felt something twist in my chest, a complicated mix of maternal instinct and frustration. Here I was, trying to navigate my own life falling apart, and suddenly, I was being positioned as the solution to everyone else's housing crisis. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who was supposedly being turned against was now the one everyone needed to turn to. This changes everything, Emma said, voicing what I was thinking. She stood up from the couch and began pacing where David had been moments before, her movement agitated and sharp. This isn't about helping David save money for a couple months. This is about Mom becoming the landlord for two grown men who should be figuring out their own living situations. That's not fair, David protested. I've been on my own for 3 years. This is just a rough patch. A rough patch that coincidentally aligns with Dad losing his job and needing somewhere to go? Emma's voice rose slightly, and I could see the stress of the day finally getting to her. This is starting to feel less like a family meeting and more like an intervention where Mom gets voluntold to solve everyone's problems. The room fell quiet, except for the sound of the old heating system cycling on, a familiar mechanical whisper that had been the soundtrack to countless family discussions over the years. I looked around at my family, these three people who had shaped my entire adult life, and felt the weight of their expectations settling on my shoulders like a heavy coat. Emma's right, I said finally. This does change everything. What you're asking for isn't a temporary favor, David. You're asking me to become your safety net. David stopped his restless movement and looked at me directly. I'm asking my mother if I can come home when I need help. Isn't that what families do? The question hung in the air, simple and complicated all at once. I thought about all the times I'd told my children they could always come home. That family was there when you needed it most. I'd said those words easily when they were abstract concepts, when home meant Robert and I presenting a united front to support our children. Under normal circumstances, yes, I said. But these aren't normal circumstances, are they? I'm trying to figure out how to be divorced, how to live alone, how to rebuild my life. And now you're both asking me to delay all of that to take care of you? Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. We're not asking you to take care of us. We're asking for temporary assistance while we get back on our feet. It's the same thing, Emma said flatly. You're both asking Mom to put her life on hold to manage yours. I watched my daughter defend me and felt a surge of gratitude mixed with sadness that she felt she needed to. For months, I'd been convinced that Robert was systematically turning our children against me, that I was losing them to his manipulation. But here was Emma, clearly seeing the situation for what it was, advocating for boundaries I wasn't even sure I had the strength to set myself. What would the timeline look like? I asked, surprising myself with the question. If we're talking about two people needing housing, not just one, what are we actually committing to? David looked hopeful at my question, while Emma's expression suggested she thought I was making a mistake. Robert maintained his careful neutral expression, the one he'd perfected during years of difficult business negotiations. I'd need maybe 4 months, David said. Time to find a new roommate or save enough for a security deposit somewhere cheaper. And Dad needs time to find work, so maybe 6 months total? 6 months? I repeated, tasting the words. 6 months of living with my soon-to-be ex-husband while trying to process our divorce? 6 months of having adult children in the house when I'm trying to figure out who I am on my own? The weight of it settled over me like fog. 6 months of navigating shared spaces with Robert, of inevitable awkward encounters in the kitchen at midnight, of having to coordinate schedules and negotiate household decisions with someone I was actively divorcing. 6 months of being needed by everyone while trying to figure out what I needed for myself. There's something else, Emma said quietly, and I felt my heart sink even further. Something I haven't told any of you yet. The silence that followed Emma's words felt thick enough to cut. I watched my daughter's face, noting the way she was gripping her coffee mug with both hands, the slight tremor in her voice that suggested whatever she was about to tell us would shift our entire conversation once again. What is it, sweetheart? I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I was ready for another revelation. The living room, which had felt spacious when I'd first moved into this rental house, now seemed to shrink with each new complication my family presented. Emma took a deep breath, her eyes moving between the three of us before settling on me. I got laid off last week, the whole marketing department. They're restructuring, and since I was the most recent hire. She shrugged, but I could see the worry lines around her eyes that she was trying to hide. The impact of her words hit me like a physical blow. My daughter, my fierce advocate who had just been defending my right to boundaries and independence, was facing her own crisis. The irony wasn't lost on me that she'd been telling David and Robert they shouldn't burden me while carrying her own burden in silence. Emma, I breathed, setting down my own mug and leaning forward. Why didn't you tell us sooner? Because of this. She gestured at the three of us gathered in my living room, at the tension that had been building all afternoon. Because I could see what was happening, with Dad needing help, and David needing help, and I didn't want to add to the pile. I thought I could handle it on my own. Find something quickly? Robert's carefully maintained neutral expression cracked. How long can you manage without income? Maybe 6 weeks if I'm really careful, Emma admitted. I've been applying for jobs constantly, but the market is tough right now. Everyone wants experience I don't quite have yet, or they want someone willing to take a significant pay cut. I felt the walls of possibility closing in around us. David needing 4 months, Robert needing 6 months, and now Emma, my stable, independent daughter, who had been my beacon of hope in this whole mess, facing unemployment with limited savings. David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his father that it made my chest tight. This changes things, he said quietly. I can't ask Mom to help me if Emma needs help too. It doesn't change anything, Emma said firmly, but I could hear the fear underneath her determination. I'm not asking anyone for anything. I'm just being honest about where things stand. But it did change everything, and we all knew it. The mathematics of our family crisis had shifted dramatically. Instead of managing 2 people needing temporary shelter, we were now looking at 3 adult children facing various forms of instability, all orbiting around me and my little rental house like planets seeking gravity. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the small front yard I'd been so proud of when I'd first rented this place. It had represented independence, a fresh start, a place that was entirely mine to make decisions about. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the grass that needed mowing. I need a minute to think, I said, not turning around. Behind me, I could hear the soft sounds of my family waiting. Robert clearing his throat quietly, David's foot tapping against the leg of his chair, Emma's barely audible sigh. The truth was, I felt trapped between 2 versions of myself. There was the mother who had always prided herself on being the family's safe harbor, the one who made everything work, who solved problems and provided stability. That version of me wanted to throw open my doors and gather all of them close, to recreate some version of family, even in the midst of divorce. But there was also this newer version of myself, the one who had been learning to live alone, to make decisions without consulting anyone, to prioritize my own needs. That version of me recognized that taking in Robert and David for 6 months would be stepping backward into a caretaking role that I'd been trying to evolve beyond. Can I ask something? I said, still facing the window. What would happen if I said no? If I told all of you that I can't be the solution to everyone's housing crisis right now? The question hung in the air. It felt dangerous to ask, like I might be revealing myself as selfish or uncaring. But I needed to understand what we were really talking about, whether this was genuine need or simply the path of least resistance for everyone. I'd figure something out, David said after a long pause. Maybe I could find someone looking for a roommate quickly, even if it meant living somewhere less convenient. I have colleagues who might know of opportunities, Robert added, though his voice lacked conviction. It would mean taking something beneath my experience level, but that might be where I am right now. Emma was quiet longer, and when she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than before. I'd probably have to move back in with college friends temporarily, share a couch or something, until I could get back on my feet. I turned back to face them, taking in the picture they made in my living room. 3 adults who had once been my primary responsibility, now asking me to take on that role again in a completely different context. The complexity of loving them while also trying to establish my own independence felt overwhelming. "Here's what I'm struggling with," I said, settling back into my chair. 6 months ago, we were a family unit making decisions together. Now we're in the middle of a divorce, David. You're an adult trying to establish your independence. And Emma, you're building your career. Taking all of you in feels like we're moving backward instead of forward.